Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. I would ask everyone in-house to make a courtesy check that cell phones have been turned off as we begin. And, of course, we will post the program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference, and our Internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments at any time by email, simply addressing it to speaker@heritage.org. We are pleased at Heritage today to be co-hosting this program with the Project for the Common Defense. For those unfamiliar with the project, it is a coalition of independent volunteers committed to national defense policies that are defined by strategic clarity and robust capabilities. This initiative, launched by Heritage and the American Enterprise Institute last year, is designed to forge a consensus around core national interest and the concept of peace through strength. The project includes seasoned policymakers, analysts, veterans, and others who have significant operational and policy experience in these areas. We are pleased today that our program will be moderated and directed by Christopher Griffin. Chris joined the Foreign Policy Initiative as Executive Director in January 2013. He previously served as Legislative Director to Senator Joseph Lieberman of Connecticut, advising the senator on the full range of legislative proposals as well as key votes. Prior to joining the senator's staff, he was a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focused on U.S. foreign and defense policy toward the Asia-Pacific. During his time at AEI, he also was contributing editor to the Armed Forces Journal, writing feature articles on international defense and industrial cooperation in the monthly column entitled Blogs of War. Please join me in welcoming Chris Griffin. Chris?
Thank you. Great. Thank you very much, John, to the team here at the Heritage Foundation and to everybody who works on the Project for Common Defense for all the great work that you are doing to advance this debate. Before introducing our speakers and getting the conversation started, would like to raise just 2 points to help set the context for what we're talking about as we look at Dr. Carter's nomination to take over the Defense Department. One, Dr. Carter last left the Defense Department in December 2013 when he was then Deputy Secretary of Defense. Since that time, we've seen Russia invade Ukraine. We've seen the terrorist group that calls itself the Islamic State take over large swaths of Iraq and Syria. We've seen the government in Yemen collapse under the combination of an Iranian-backed insurgency and an al-Qaeda terrorist group. We've seen North Korea conduct a cyber attack against the United States, and of course a series of brutal terrorist attacks that have occurred around the world. The job onto which Dr. Carter is embarking is an incredibly difficult one under any circumstance. Has gotten more difficult over the past year. Two, it's not just the world that's growing more dangerous, but the budgetary risks that the Department of Defense faces here at home. All 4 service chiefs testified this morning that the defense cuts that the department is facing is putting the lives of our troops at risks, and that the armed forces will not be able to execute the national strategy or their missions without additional funding. To set the context for the discussion that we're going to have today about the challenges that Dr. Carter faces, it's a real pleasure to welcome 4 experts, all of whom are also serving with the Project for Common Defense. We'll introduce them briefly in the order that they'll be speaking and thank them very much for joining us today. Daniel Garay is Vice President at the Lexington Institute. His government experience includes serving as the Director of the Office of Strategic Competitiveness in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. After Daniel, we'll hear from Brian McGrath, who is Deputy Director of the Center for American Sea Power at the Hudson Institute. He's also the Managing Director of the Ferry Bridge Group. During his career in the Navy, Brian was the lead author of the Department of Navy's 2007 Maritime Strategy. After Brian, we'll hear from Jerry McGinn, who's the president of McGinn Defense Consulting. His career has spanned the defense industry, think tanks, and government. During that time, he has served, amongst other roles, as special assistant in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Last, we'll hear from Michaela Dodge, who is a policy analyst here at the Heritage Foundation, who really provides invaluable expertise in the areas of missile defense, nuclear weapons modernization, and arms control policy. We couldn't have four better experts to speak to the challenges that Dr. Carter will face. And with that, hand off to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thanks to the Heritage Foundation for hosting this, and the Project for Common Defense for hosting this session. You know, you have to admire the commitment to public service of individuals such as the incoming Secretary of Defense, Ashton Carter. To accept the task of managing the Department of Defense in the final 2 years of the Obama administration is, at the very least, an example of selflessness over self-preservation. Or perhaps, as is said in another context, the triumph of hope over experience. Dr. Carter accepts the post knowing that he faces a remarkable array of challenges and difficulty. There is the problem that the White House wants to make all important decisions on defense issues, and in fact many of the small ones, being accused of micromanaging the operations against ISIS in Syria and Iraq. He is well aware that the FY 2016 budget he will have to defend on Capitol Hill is tens of billions of dollars above the spending ceiling imposed by the Budget Control Act under sequestration. In fact, he also knows that the defense program that he will support will crater if sequestration comes back into effect, as Chris was pointing out the testimony of the Joint Chiefs just today. This will force incredibly painful decisions on the Pentagon generally and the Secretary of Defense in particular. He faces a Republican-dominated Congress, the leaders of whom have made it clear that they will take their responsibilities for oversight and investigations very seriously. There is little chance that Congress will defer to DOD when it comes to issues of force structure, weapon systems, or cost-cutting strategies. All these difficulties might be tolerable in an era of global peace, but Secretary Carter knows better than most that he will occupy the big office on the Pentagon's E-ring at a time of rising threats to the global order and to U.S. security. Moreover, he must appreciate the growing unhappiness at home, abroad, and even within his own department with the president's strategies and policies for dealing with these threats. So with little control over matters of strategy, budgets, forces, or threats, what's left for the incoming Secretary of Defense to do? What's he going to have an impact on in the next 2 years? I will suggest to you one thing: defense acquisition. Ironically, it is precisely the intersection of the challenges and difficulties that I've described above that creates an opportunity in the last quarter of the Obama administration to make some major improvements, or at least start the process, in the way the Pentagon acquires goods and services. Now, Secretary Carter is no novice when it comes to acquisition reform. As many of you may remember, as Undersecretary of Defense for AT&L, Acquisition Technology and Logistics, he aggressively sought ways of improving the performance of the acquisition system and saving costs. He was the architect of the original better buying power strategy, now on his third iteration under Carter's successors, Undersecretary Frank Kendall. Now, unfortunately, the last foray he had into the realm of acquisition reform produced relatively little in the way of demonstrable improvements in the system's performance. In fact, for example, one of their slogan items, which was to increase competition defense contracting, actually went the other way. It's actually declined as a percentage of all contracts in the past several years. So now is the time for the department and the new Secretary of Defense to take a different approach. I would argue to you that the challenges presented by current and emerging threats and the very real possibility of sequestration returning in 2016 offer him the cover to take bold steps regarding defense acquisition. Like Nixon to China, who better to reform the system, and in particular to change the relationship between the department and the private sector than the man who created better buying power. I would argue to you that the Secretary should make it a central objective of his tenure to improve the relationship between the Pentagon and industry, which has deteriorated significantly over the past 6 years. This means, among other things, addressing industry's concerns over topics such as control of intellectual property, profits, other incentives for remaining in the defense industry, approaches to cost reduction, and, for example, the use of commercially acceptable standards in areas such as accounting and system safety. These are particularly important topics in view of DoD's desire to promote greater innovation in defense goods and services and its interest in gaining greater access to commercial technologies and ideas. Companies used to working in the commercial sector tend to take one look at the arcane world of DoD accounting, contracting, and all the rest, and run for the exit. Dr. Carter, another topic here, is the poster child for the revolving door between the private sector or academia and DoD. Contrary to the criticisms by some, this revolving door is actually a good thing. Too few acquisition officials have a clue as to how industry operates or the factors that motivate decisions by private business. Secretary Carter should seek to reform the rules on conflict of interest in order to draw more experienced industry officials into the acquisition system. The new secretary should rein in the Pentagon's mania for competition. In fact, there's a good evidence to suggest that increasing the frequency of competition actually raise the costs to both industry and government. If you compete it, you have to judge it. That takes time and money. Moreover, the Pentagon could save a lot of money and time if it consulted more with industry on such issues as the cost of individual performance requirements or alternative approaches to life cycle management before releasing an RFP, rather than focusing obsessively on competition between contractors and therefore maintaining an arm's length policy towards the industry. The Secretary may also wish to revisit and revise his former opposition to defense mergers. Now, back in 2011, as the magnitude of the decline in defense spending became evident, then Undersecretary Carter made clear his department's opposition to the kinds of mergers of major defense companies that occurred in the 1990s, the famous Last Supper. Today, many defense companies, including some of the largest in the industry, are essentially one or two contracts or programs away from exiting at least part of the defense industry, if not the sector entirely. Given the dearth of new starts and the increasing tendency of DoD to seek modifications to extend the life or expand the mission set of existing systems and platforms, once a company exits a sector or subsector, there's virtually no chance for reentry. Areas such as armored fighting vehicles, artillery, and ships are already down essentially to two competitors at best. Aircraft, helicopters, and missiles are likely to follow. So, if you lose in a couple of these areas, even if you're a big company, you may be on the ragged edge of being profitable or even credible in the defense sector. So Secretary Carter ought to be thinking now about how to manage the next round of defense consolidations, including of the majors. So really, he has an opportunity to do something fairly substantial here, but just not in any of the areas that one would imagine, not in strategy, forces, or threats. On the other hand, fixing parts of the acquisition system would be a very good outcome over the next 2 years. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. A great vision of a Secretary of Defense acquisition. Brian, please.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks to Heritage and the PCD for the opportunity to be here. For a middle-aged conservative, this is kind of like spring training fantasy camp to be on a panel at Heritage. I have a few brief remarks today owing to our tight schedule, but then also because I barely have the capacity to manage my small life, let alone give Ashton Carter advice on how to face the immense challenges he has ahead of him. But this is Washington, this is a think tank, and so such trivial modesty has to be put aside in favor of good conversation. That said, I'll stick to sea power, if that's okay with you, because that's about the only thing I really understand. I have a lot of professional admiration and respect for Ashton Carter. He's an able bureaucrat, and I use that term bureaucrat in its full, positive Wilsonian sense. I was pleased when he agreed to serve as Secretary of Defense, though, as Dan indicated, I had a tough time understanding why anyone would have taken the job, given the marginalization Mr. Hagel faced and the well-publicized phenomenon of centralization in the White House. But we're fortunate as a citizenry that he has decided to serve. One can only guess that he has at least tacitly agreed to serve for the remainder of the administration. So I think that what that does is gives us a good time horizon, at least gives me a good time horizon within which to bound my remarks. So what I'd like to do is to lay out three pressing challenges that I think Dr. Carter will face during the next 2 years that appertain to sea power. The first is within the Navy's Unmanned Carrier-Launched Airborne Surveillance and Strike System, or UCLASS. Essentially, he's going to eventually have to make a Solomonic decision between those who favor a surveillance-heavy approach to this program versus those who favor a strike-heavy approach to the program. Such a decision will have clear and dramatic impacts on the requirements, capabilities, and design of the airframe that fills the mission. For ease of understanding, the forces favoring surveillance-privileged airframe, represented broadly by the Brahmin of Naval Aviation and led by the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Sandy Winnefeld, these people wish to be modest about what is possible in the near and midterm and are somewhat chastened by the experience of acquiring the Joint Strike Fighter. In their view, the carrier's need for long-range, high-endurance intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, or ISR, outweighs its need for semi-autonomous strike in contested environments, and that the ISR capability can be had with significantly less risk and lower cost. Their view is that current technologies can be adapted easily for the carrier involvement, and that these technologies would be more than sufficient to the ISR task. On the other side are those who would have the U-class privilege strike in contested environments. This side is ably represented at the top by Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work, and their point is that the Navy is already sufficiently investing in maritime ISR with the P-8 Maritime Patrol Aircraft and the Northrop Grumman MQ-4C Triton land-based unmanned system. More importantly, however, is the growing clamor for the carrier's air wing to buy back range that it traded after the Cold War ended. To this point, Work has skillfully managed the bureaucratic infighting to keep the Navy from moving in a direction that he does not favor. Ultimately, though, the decision on this issue will be Dr. Carter's, and it is very likely to happen in these 2 years. The second challenge facing Dr. Carter will be the Navy's shipbuilding plan. With each budget, the Navy releases what's called a 30-year shipbuilding plan, which lays out, as the title would suggest, how it intends to build ships for the next 3 decades. Of those 30 years, the first 2 are largely set. The second 3 are a good bet, plus or minus. The next 5 are hit or miss, and the last 20 are utterly fungible. What has been consistent and dependable, however, are the historic constant dollar spending levels that this country devotes to the building of ships. Viewed through this lens, the plan is dramatically underfunded. Eric Labs from the CBO has concluded that CBO's estimate of $20.7 billion per year over the full 30 years for shipbuilding plan, that's what the plan will cost. That's 32% higher than the $15.7 billion a year, again in constant dollars, that the Navy historically receives to build ships. In his latest report, Labs conducted a thought experiment in which he looked at the 30-year plan and using rough ratios of forces in existence today and the Navy's stated goal of fully building out its ballistic submarine force, he showed that rather than buying 264 ships over 30 years, the Navy would only buy 195 ships in that time, such that at the end of the plan, the fleet would stand at a mighty 242 ships, which is significantly less than the 285 or 286 we have in today's fleet. The third sea power challenge worth mentioning is, as it ever seems to be, just what is the role of the Marine Corps to be? I say this not because I believe that the role or its importance is in doubt with me, but because there is in this age, as in past ages, many who doubt. After nearly a decade and a half of land war, the Marine Corps has gotten heavier and less mobile, more of a land force than an amphibious naval force. I'm heartened by the words and deeds I see coming from the Marine Corps headquarters, and I am confident that the Corps does in fact wish to return to its naval roots. But what do they mean when they talk about returning to ships? Will we continue to resource capability to conduct opposed surface assaults, therefore requiring new generations of amphibious combat vehicles that are equally good at swimming as they are fighting on land? Or will we see land-privileged vehicles that get taken to shore in unarmed connectors? Or will we see the Corps primarily using vertical envelopment riding to combat in MV-22s? It's an article of faith in pleasant salons that we'll never conduct an opposed landing again. And so preparing to do so is wasteful. I disagree, and I hope Dr. Carter does too. Sea power provides immense mobility to its land component, the Marine Corps, and that mobility forces the enemy to consider numerous avenues of approach. He cannot defend everywhere with the same level of confidence, but forcing him to try will always be to our advantage. Walking away from this capability leaves us with fewer options, something always worth guarding against. One final thing for Mr. Carter, and this does come from my experience, and that is resist the urge to do your last job. Every ship's commanding officer is a really good executive officer. Mr. Carter has been a superb Undersecretary for AT&L and an even better Deputy Secretary of Defense. He knows those jobs as well as the people occupying them today and could wade into those fights on day one and be just as good as they are. He must resist it. He has to be the kind of Secretary of Defense that he wanted to serve under, and he has to leave the implementation details to others. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Brian. And Jerry.
Great. I'd like to thank Heritage and the Project for the Common Defense for co-hosting this event, and it's a privilege to speak with you all and be here with my fellow panelists. I'd like to state up front, agreeing with Dan and Brian, that it's somewhat baffling why Dr. Carter accepted the President's nomination. But the country, I believe, our country is fortunate to have a defense professional of Dr. Carter's caliber that has agreed to serve. I find it frankly humorous that most of the press reports you read about or hear about Dr. Carter call him a technocrat, a bureaucrat, a manager, and the like. And it makes sense in one aspect because his recent roles were Undersecretary for Acquisition, Technology, Logistics, as well as Deputy Secretary. But I first heard of Dr. Carter back in the 90s when he was Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy in the Clinton administration. And back then, he was strictly known as a policy wonk that was not at all known for his managerial experience. So the fact that he's able to that he's added to his skill set and set of competencies over the last 6 years is a credit to him, should he be confirmed as Secretary. Now, much of the hearings next week, the hearing for Dr. Carter next week, will focusing on some of the things that my colleagues have discussed: force structure, force levels, budget levels, and these are important issues. There's been a lot of writing about them, particularly last year's National Defense Panel had some good bipartisan ideas on that. But I'd like to focus my remarks on what I call 4 critical cross-cutting issues that impact the entire defense enterprise, regardless of funding or force levels. And I do this for 2 reasons. The first reason is that I agree particularly with Dan, that the course of this administration, defense-wise, is set. I mean, they have 6 years down the road. There's 2 years left. I don't see how Dr. Carter, despite all his stature, would be able to move the needle in terms of budgets or force structure or strategy. But secondly, I do see a real opportunity. There is an opportunity over the next 2 years to make some lasting impacts on essential areas that are not necessarily, the most headline-grabbing, but will really put the department on a firmer foundation going into the next administration. So to build on that point, in my view, there are 4 factors which play a large role in the success of the defense enterprise. These are determine what kind of systems the department creates and how these are employed and how effectively they are employed around the world. And those are the defense industrial base, the defense acquisition system, both of which Dan talked about a bit in his remarks, as well as international security cooperation, how we partner with allies and partners, and the defense business enterprise. Now, the degree to which these factors are innovative, agile, efficient, and effective will have a significant impact on the effectiveness of our forces, regardless of and how they address our challenges in the coming years. Now, I think Dr. Carter has experience in each of these areas, and he could really enable change, particularly coupled with his strong deputy, Dr. Bob Work, over the next 2 years. So I'm going to touch briefly on each of these 4 issues. On the defense industrial base, the private sector is the engine of innovation for U.S. defense and U.S. commercial enterprise. But what has happened in the past 3 years is 20% cut in real terms on defense spending has really made a lot of perturbations in the industrial base. There's been a lot of overhead cuts, but these overhead cuts have not just been business development or strategy types, but have also been engineers that are help building the new technologies of the future. Companies are healthy right now financially, but it's a question of how long that the overhead cutting can continue. This also leads to questions of mergers and acquisitions. We haven't had a big set of major acquisitions, but there's been a lot of smaller niche acquisitions and a couple mid-tier moves by companies to help either diversify out of the just defense or strengthen a functional area in the defense market. And then thirdly, there's been a decline in private sector research and development funding, given some of the budgetary uncertainty in defense. I think that Dr. Carter and the Defense Department need to take really hold of this and how they approach the industrial base and really develop a new model for a 21st century government and industry partnership. The Defense Industry Initiative, which was launched late November by Secretary Hagel, was a small start in that area. And we just heard Dr. Work talk about the offset strategies, as he called them, earlier today in another forum. But these are the right kind of ideas, but they need strong leadership and from the top, because if it stays within just the department, within the government bureaucracy, it's going to be much less effective. Because the key is that we've had an inverse of innovation. Back in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, the technology came mostly out of the defense industrial base for things like GPS and the like, whereas today, 3D printing, the cloud, big data, that's all coming from the commercial sector. And as Dan alluded to, companies that are looking to enter into the government marketplace or defense marketplace often go running when they were confronted with the FAR and the DFAR. So we've got to really fix how we do that. Which leads me to the second area, which is the defense acquisition system. The acquisition reform is a hardy perennial, and as again Dan mentioned, Dr. Carter started the Better Buying Power initiatives back when he was undersecretary. Now these have been really good faith efforts. Frank Kendall's a tremendous civil government servant, but it is impossible for the government to do a lot of these things themselves. What they do, sit around with a lot of government officials trying to make decisions, but they don't have the mechanisms that they need to be able to really radically change the system. And so that's why we've really got to have an outside approach, and which is why it's good Dr. Carter's coming in after being outside again for a while, so we can really take some things that were innovative models during the Afghanistan and Iraq War. The JIATO and REF are the two poster children, the Joint Improvised Explosive Defeat Organization and the Rapid Equipping Force, getting these kind of ability to develop and field technologies quickly and rapidly, as opposed to the arcane and bureaucratic mechanisms of the current federal acquisition regulation. The third area is how we partner with our allies and other countries. There's been a lot of work in this area in recent years, principally in the area of export control reform, but there's still significant challenges that remain. There's a lot of uncertainty for companies, and that creates unpredictability and unnecessary burdens. But another big area that you're seeing is this tremendous increase in competition in the international marketplace. Companies are competing internationally as well as they try to get a share of the declining defense market. Where you have situations like in Turkey recently where a Chinese offering was selected for an air defense system, That's still under, that still may not go through, but that was just totally unexpected, as opposed to a traditional U.S. or European selection for that. So to address these, you need some innovative business models. Staying away from just foreign military sales and or just direct commercial sales, and some kind of hybrid approach to do that. And also building exportability in the front end of systems so that you can collaborate better with our partners. And finally, on the defense enterprise, the Pentagon is the largest office building in the world, and the Defense Department is the largest bureaucracy in the world. There's been a lot of effort by the last 3 secretaries to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of the organization through overhead cuts, through other ways to create more efficiencies. However, there's still a long way to go. The secretary, unlike a corporate leader, does not have a way to measure the performance of his organization. There's no kind of performance dashboard that really allows him to really say, my organization is as ready as it needs to be in these areas, and so on. He doesn't. There's an excess of bases in real estate within the department. GAO is recently estimated at 20%, and as well as there's tremendous geographic dispersion for back office functions. You have thousands of financial management personnel in Texas and in Virginia and in California, whereas the private sector has moved on from that a long, long time ago. So the department can really aggressively embrace private sector business practices in some of these areas in performance management and in shared services that would really help the department save resources. And I would my advice to the Secretary would be to stay away from another round of BRAC, which is a great idea, but it's just not a non-starter, and focusing on things that he can do, that he has control, or he can win congressional support for. So, in sum, I think based on his experience, Dr. Carter is well positioned to lead the department in these areas. And I think, and I agree with Dan, I think that he'll be pushing on an open door in a lot of these areas. I mean, Mac Thornberry on the Hill is talking about acquisition reform. There's a lot of receptivity for these kind of ideas that are not headline grabbing, but really will put the department on a better standing for the future. So, thank you.
Thank you, Jerry.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you to my colleagues who did a wonderful job outlining big challenges for the Secretary of Defense. Thank you to the PCD for co-hosting this event with us. Now, let me continue by highlighting challenges in the area of nuclear deterrence and missile defense. The nuclear issue is so important that Secretary Hagel, who as a private citizen endorsed the Global Zero Nuclear Report, calling for reductions in U.S. spending on nuclear weapons and for unilateral reductions in our nuclear stockpile and actively deployed weapons, is leaving department calling for additional $1 billion over the next 7 years to be spent for nuclear infrastructure. Now, this funding is forthcoming despite sequestration caps, and we'll see how it plays out in the years ahead. But why is that? Why is there so much support or why is there so much attention to this issue? Well, the simple and somewhat idealistic response is that the nuclear weapons continue to be essential for U.S. national security. Now, why idealistic? Well, the more kind of cynical response or more complicated response has to do with the Air Force and the Navy morale issues, deterioration across the nuclear weapons complex, and underinvestment in it over the past 2 decades. Now, for the Air Force, this is not for the first time in recent history when we see this continuing attention and continuing studies. Same for the Navy. Now, the underinvestment contributed to cheating and other misconduct in the nuclear forces that we've discovered early last year. Now, since then, the Department of Defense has gone through 4 separate reviews and produced over 1,000 pages of observations, recommendations designed to mitigate the situation within the nuclear enterprise. On the weapons side, on the Department of Energy side, the National Nuclear Security Administration went through a its own review, but I shall limit my remarks to challenges for the Secretary of Defense. So the key issue is, will the Secretary of Defense, to be able to sustain funding and good attention to the nuclear enterprise? And there are three main challenges, and my working names for these challenges are resources versus sequestration, attention versus morale, and third one is leadership. Now first, aside for general difficulties of providing for the common defense, as my colleagues outlined, the Department of Defense must make sure that additional funding is spent well, not just spent. That's not going to help anyone. We should prioritize allocating funding for more people for the Navy and for the Air Force, especially for maintenance, training, and security. We need to provide new or sufficient equipment for airmen, sailors, and Marines to get their jobs done, including provide for a sufficient training infrastructure. Right now, if you walk in a silo, it's really, really old. It stinks really bad, and the stink lingers with you for hours after you walk out. It's not what I would call a motivational environment to work with. Despite the importance of the mission, the infrastructure is just old. Now, interestingly, the demands on the nuclear mission did not change over the years. However, today we have fewer people to get the job done. And manpower shortages are at the core of the problem on the operational side. Leadership attention shortages are at the core of the problem on the strategic side. Which brings me to my second point, which is attention versus morale. Now, after all, this is not the first time that the Air Force is going through the cycle of reviews. So what usually happens? Usually, we get really scared, we pay attention to the issue for a couple months, we throw money at it, and if nothing happens, then we go back to the business as usual. Now, why should it be different this time around? Well, this time around, it must be different. The margins to accomplish the mission, accomplish it well, and not break the force are narrowing down. Now, I would also submit that the problems are structural, they're systemic, and they're not going to be fixed overnight. We will probably need at least a couple of years of good attention and funding in the right places to improve the problems of the forces. And in the meantime, we should not be that surprised if we see some more problems. Now, there is an underlying theme to challenges expressed above, and that's a lack of leadership. Now, I'm afraid that previous secretaries of defense did not really help Dr. Carter in terms of publishing their memoirs, while the president is still in office. But a good relationship between the president and the Secretary of Defense is the key to resolving all of the challenges we've really outlined on this panel. Now, with respect to the Pentagon's enterprise, presidential leadership and continued attention of the White House is really the key ingredients to achieving success with respect to reforming the nuclear complex. Now, we tend to talk about our nuclear complex as in focused inwards. Its criticality, however, becomes apparent only in relation to outside threats. The enemy always gets a vote and always has a say in whatever next Secretary of Defense's agenda item is going to be, and we should not forget that. Now, in the last part of my talk, let me address missile defense challenges. Now, on missile defense, we are clumsily trying to keep up with the ballistic missile threat. We are not doing that great of a job. The president made certain changes to our missile defense policy in the previous years. For example, we canceled phase 4 of the European phased adaptive approach. That was a phase designed to deal with long-range ballistic missiles, primarily from Iran, according to official explanations. Well, coincidentally, that was also the phase that Russia objected to most. Now, the premise of our nuclear posture, the premise of our missile defense posture, is that Russia is no longer an adversary and that the potential for conflict is low. Now, that was before Russia invaded Ukraine, and I suspect that we might see the situation differently today. Now, revisionist Russia and sequestration will be two main challenges to Secretary Carter's nuclear and missile defense policy. Now, I certainly think that we should not constrain our missile defense to a limited ballistic missile threat. Now, despite that, we will see continued opposition to U.S. plans in Europe, and I suspect that in a bad way, Russia is doing us service by invading Ukraine and allowing us to step back and perhaps assess its goals or Mr. Putin's goals a little more realistically. Now, let me close by quoting Marine Corps General James Mattis. "You can overcome wrong technology. Your people have the initiative, they see the problem, no big deal. You cannot overcome bad culture." And that's going to be one of the main challenges in the years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Michaela. Thank you, all four of you, for a great set of remarks. We'll ask one question before opening it up to the group. In terms of framing the challenges awaiting Secretary Carter, assuming he's confirmed, you could break it down into national security policy, budgets, and management and acquisitions policy. And in your remarks, I think a point that came up really consistently is that the areas where Secretary Carter will have the most opportunities, once confirmed, will really be on management and acquisitions. That it appears that from the experiences of the last two Secretaries of Defense that they've not had much impact on national security policy. Budgets to some degree out of their hand, but particularly the third point, the budgetary question. And as we look forward to, in October, the return of full sequestration and the role that Dr. Carter can have in the public debate about whether full sequestration will be reimposed or whether there will be additional budget room. And it sounds like without that additional budget room, that executing on any of these points, from the shipbuilding plan, figuring out the role of the Marine Corps, figuring out how to improve the relationship with industry, could be very difficult to execute. So Dan, would start with you and open it up for everyone else to contribute as you like. As you look forward to the $500 billion question between now and October, what role would you see Secretary Carter playing in that debate?
None. I mean, this debate is finished. What is there left to say? It is transparently obvious that to cut the budget the way sequestration requires is to, as I said, create a defense. Right? This has been said now by how many secretaries, how many chiefs of staff, how many experts, how many panels have we had here that have addressed the same issue? I mean, it is sort of one side is transmitting and there's nobody receiving as far as that's entirely true. I mean, those who pay attention or those who have an abiding concern for national security, such as Mac Thornberry, such as Senator McCain, understand this problem. Buck McKeon before him. I mean, these people understand this problem. There is not a consensus on strategy, role of the U.S. in the world, need for strong forces, or at least if there's a consensus, it's all lip service. So honestly, it's not that he can't say the right things. I mean, he's will be as good as anybody else at saying it. That's not the problem. There's nothing new to say, and nobody has, I'm sure the people in this panel, with all due respect, that can think of a new way of making the point that this is a bad idea, so that it actually takes hold on Capitol Hill, and more importantly, so that the two sides, that is Republican majority in Congress and the White House, can come to some agreement. And I see nothing in what's happened since the new Congress has taken, actually since the election, but certainly not since the new Congress has been sworn in, that indicates that these two parties are going to get along at all on about anything. So why should it be the case in sequestration?
I think we all sort of congealed around these concepts of management and this small ball stuff, largely because it's the last 2 years of an administration, and these are the areas where he can have the most influence with the least amount of external help or interference. It just was an easy kill.
Very good point.
Yeah, I would largely pile on. I mean, I would think that, you know, if Secretary Gates, former Secretary Gates, Panetta could not stop sequestration, I don't know what Carter himself can do, right? So I would think that the things that we're advocating for, small ball, I think is the right way to put it, are things that would allow them to get, you know, more out of a smaller pie. And that kind of demonstration could help with certain constituencies on the Hill to either strengthen funding for sets of programs or that could ameliorate sequestration. But I just think that it's beyond, it's larger forces.
You know, I think Secretary of Defense will continue to play an important role in contributing towards public discourse and explaining how sequestration is bad as it actually kicks in, kind of showing the pain that chiefs and other secretaries of defense have been describing for years now. But I think I agree with my colleagues, whether that's going to be enough to change the situation, I'm not entirely convinced of that.
Right, something to look forward to. Floor is open for questions. We have a microphone. Please wait for it to come around. Please state your name and affiliation, and of course, please ask a question. Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Hermes. My question is just about what do you think explain the repeated vows of Secretary of Defense from the one to Secretary Carter? And will not he also be confronted with the same problem if he gets nominated?
This is the continuation of challenges. I think a point here that's particularly worth bringing up is the question of the role of the National Security Council staff versus the Pentagon. That's some points that I think particularly Secretary Hagel has raised in the past few months. If anyone would like to take that.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of respect for Dr. Carter. Outside just what he's done at the Pentagon, he's written a lot on strategy and other issues. But I don't think there's any perception on our part. I don't hear it. I don't see it out there that he is being brought in to be a grand strategist, that he intends that role, or that in fact he's sort of got a vision. In fact, if you think about it, you know, Secretary Gates actually had a vision in the transition between the Bush and the Obama administrations in terms of what he wanted to do and how he wanted to do it, and that led to his what he did in the Quadrennial Defense Review that came out. I mean, he really guided that. I don't see any evidence that Secretary Carter has that in his hip pocket. So, you know, given that, I don't know that he's going to have. Put it the other way, he's actually likely to have less impact, even if he tries, than either of the three predecessors who served this president. Now, external events can change everything. I mean, that's the other thing. I guess the one thing we haven't said, which is, you know, we are in a situation where the security situation and hence budgets and all this could turn overnight if something really bad happens. If enough really bad things happen, not if something bad happens, they're happening. If it gets even worse, so you know, that's always a possibility. But absent that, you know, he's being brought in to sort of, you know, sit on the department, not to, you know, lead the nations in war.
Yeah, nothing to add to that.
Go ahead, McKellar, please.
So, you know, I would just add that Secretary of Defense's job is to implement the president's policy. And in some instances, the roots of the problems are in a view of the White House that, well, the problems are with the White House's policy. They're not per se with the whatever Secretary of Defense thinks. And so I'm not entirely sure that you could even bring someone to fix that even if you wanted. You know, I think Secretary Gates was about as strong of a Secretary of Defense as we could get in terms of making the case for U.S. military, for sufficient funding, for the importance of U.S. presence around the world. And those arguments were not winning arguments at the end of the day.
And this has, I think, been implicit in all of your remarks about some of the challenges that he'll face. But it's just worth keeping in mind the logic of how defense budgets move, that if the secretary is if Dr. Carter is confirmed as secretary, he will be defending a budget that will have been dropped just before he was confirmed. He will be executing a budget that by that point will be a year old. By the time that he is actually able to execute a budget that he will have himself help draft would be in October 2016 under the best circumstances, 1 month before the election. Just the way these time processes work is that it's a very slow ship steer process. Sir, saw your hand?
Sure. I think folks can hear me.
Yeah, for the
Maybe they can hear me better now.
Perfect, thank you.
Robbie Harris, a former naval person. I'd like to follow up on a point that I think Dan made. A friend of Brian McGrath's and mine, who knows the Hill pretty well, has said to me, and I think he said to Brian, that the issue on the Hill with national security policy, it's not so much a partisan issue that was mentioned here, but rather, with the exception of the 4 committees, no one else seems terribly interested in what's going on in national security policy. And so therefore, to form a consensus on the Hill, to change the strategy, to change the force structure, there's just no interest there. I wondered if the panel would comment on that. Do you see it that way, that no longer is there a broad consensus, a broad interest in national security policy on the Hill, but rather to the extent that there is any interest, it's within the 4 committees?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I would say, I would partially agree with you, maybe you about 18 months ago. I mean, that there was kind of a strong sort of, I would guess call it a Rand Paul moment, for lack of a better phrase. You know, there was sort of within the Republican caucus, more kind of less understanding of the threats and real kind of lack of consensus on need for a strong defense, more about focusing on cutting budgets and the like. However, I'm not a Hill expert by any means, but you've seen a change in within the Republican caucus on this, and you have seen this across the Congress. You've seen tremendous number of veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan get elected in the last two cycles. Well, maybe tremendous, not the right word, but we've gone from historical lows of congressional memberships that were combat or veterans to increasing that. So, and plus here Russia and ISIS and China have helped us, in the sense, it helped the cause in the sense of it made it clear that the threat is not, leaving Afghanistan is not going to solve all our problems. So I don't think we're, I don't think it's a done deal anymore. But I definitely don't think we were at that point anymore.
I think you're right, Robbie, to a large extent. I think there's less interest outside the committees. Although not a historian of the Congress, I don't know whether outside of those committees and in the Foreign Relations Committee there's ever been that much interest in international matters.
But they went along.
But they did. They trusted those folks. The thing that bothers me most about where we are today is the fact that it was a bipartisan effort to stick us in this hole. I wish I could dance around and point at the White House and say this is your fault, this is your fault. But that incompletely assesses the problem, because there were a lot of Republicans who were happy to put serious brakes on the defense budget and to cut the defense budget in essence. within the Republican Party, the consensus on our place in the world has broken down. I think that's a function. I think that's a function of the larger breakdown. Something Dan talks about very eloquently, which is the loss of the post-Cold War the post-World War II security consensus that guided this country.
You know, I would give you one sort of additional thought, which is a lot of this is based on a general view, certainly a Republican view, but a general view about wanting to rein in waste in the government, and you can point to any defense program you want. The irony here is, of course, we all know that there's very little margin for a new Secretary of Defense, or short-timer, anybody, to make a grand, difference. I mean, you're not going to cut the price of the F-35 in half in the next year, right? You're not going to, cut 250,000 civilians from the roles this year. So, in a sense, even were there an agreement between the Secretary or the executive branch and the legislative branch on sort of, all right, I'll give whatever you cut, sort of, I'll give you back. There's very little. I mean, even Brack, right? Complaint by Mac Thornberry just the other week at AEI was that we still haven't seen a positive return on the last Brack round. That was 10 years ago, and that's not a knock on Brack. It's just the way these things are set up. It takes long. So, even if you sort of were trying to, if the Secretary were honestly, fully trying to address the sort of one of the bases for sort of the complaint and the opposition to higher defense spending, damn little he can do.
Just one last point that brings to mind on your question, Mr. Harris, is part of the logic, particularly under the Budget Control Act, is that regardless of the degree of interest outside the Armed Services Committees and the Defense Subcommittees for Appropriations, is that over the last 2 years, the most important defense-related decision we've seen was the Balanced Budget Act, which was between Congressman Ryan and Senator Murray. That to some degree, this issue has been taken out of the pay grade of the relevant committees and the Secretary to a very high political level where it really is trapped, and how problematic that is. We have time for one more question. Jim, please.
So Jim Carapone at Heritage. So I want to go back to a comment Jerry made, and also Michaela, because I know you've written on this. So I think there's a lot of people that recognize that there are issues in management of defense infrastructure, and then everybody just kind of pushes this magic button and says BRAC, but without this kind of more robust discussion of, is that the right model, and there are other ways to do this. And so I'd just be really interested in your guys' thoughts about what are some alternatives to BRAC that people maybe should just stop using that word and come up with a different model on how to think about this.
Right. I mean, I would definitely stop using the word BRAC, and as Dan or as Chris mentioned, it is debatable the effectiveness of BRAC in terms of budgetary impact. It's harder to grab the savings, but there are ways you can do it that the department can do now. They were given authority a couple NDAAs ago to start letting non-defense agencies use parts of defense bases. Now, so if you start bringing parts of ICE, parts of other government agencies onto defense bases, that would allow kind of cost share and reduction. If you consolidate on bases, the footprint of the military footprint, that's another way you can reduce cost. One way, which I alluded to in my remarks, is about this is not BRAC, but right now you've got in the financial management back office function, you've got huge shared service centers within the military services. You've got an OSD shared service in Indiana. These are all in different geographic locations, performing very similar functions. It's painful, but that's something totally within DoD's control. We're going to house the financial management function for the Army in this place and this place only. We're going to do it for OSD here, or just DoD here. You can make those. Corporations do that all the time. And Deloitte's, my former employer, had one at shared service center in Texas. A lot of them are in Texas. A lot of these, that reduces a lot of costs, and will get at some of the infrastructure reductions that you're looking at.
Maybe my comment would be that if we're not really thinking about what kind of forces we need to address what kinds of threats, the Bragg discussion cannot be only about cutting. It has to be about flexibility. It has to be about what we expect our military infrastructure to do. And for now, we just don't have consensus on basics, as my colleagues mentioned and as Dan so well articulated. And absent that consensus, I'm not sure that we're going to be able to move anywhere or on anything, let alone the controversial issue like Bragg.
We'll ask you to join me in thanking the Heritage Foundation, the Project for Common Defense, for organizing this event today, to thank our 4 excellent speakers, and we'll have their great remarks in mind as we look forward to Dr. Carter's confirmation hearing in the coming week. Thank you all for coming today, and thank you again. Thank you.